Shalom Aleichem, everybody. Today's daf is daf Hey. In Zvachim, we start from 3 lines on the top, from the top. So Rami Rish Lakish al Ma'oyi B'Midrash. Rish Lakish was lying on his stomach in the Beis Medrash, and he asked the following question: Umakshi on the Mishnah. I see over here they bring down. Why is it important to know the bodily position of Rish Lakish? He was lying, he was sitting. So he brings from the Torah Lishma, which is the Ben Ish Chai, the Ben Yayada, who says it's to teach you that there's no pagam in Kavod Torah if you're talking and learning while you're lying on your stomach. If you need to rest a little bit, I guess fakert. It's a Kavod Torah that even when you're lying on your stomach, you are you're Isaac in Torah. So Ramesh Lakshal Ma'oibe Midrasha Makshi, and he asked the following question: Im Ksherim Heim Yiratzu. In the Mishnah says that Kol Zvachim Shenizbuchu Shloi Lishman, it's Ksherim, it's kosher, and the Elul Shaloi Olul Bailam Shem Chayva. But the Bailam didn't fulfill his obligation or his neder if the carbon was brought Shaloi Lishma. So the Gemara says, Rish Lakish asked the following: if it's kosher, which means you could still bring it in this Mizbeach Yiratzu, then why not be Yoitza with that carbon? Vim ein meratzin, but if you can't use it as a kapara or to fulfill your obligation, lama boin, why bring it at all? Kitzur Maisa, the Rish Lakish's question is that it should become puzzle. If it's not meratza, it should be puzzle, right? It's b'derech memanavshech, and if it is meratza, and if it's kosher, then you should be meratza. Okay, I see over here it brings on the bottom the ikar kasha Rish Lakish is that the carbon should become puzzle lagamri. If it's not meratza, it should be puzzle lagamri. Amr Rabbi Eliezer, Amr Rabbi Eliezer, this is Rabbi Eliezer the Amoira. We find in another case, an example of this idea that it's kosher and it's not maratza. Where do we find that? By karbonis, where the bailam died, and you could still bring it l'achar misa. Okay, where's this Mishnah? Not an isha shehevia chatasa or mesa yevi yorshan oilasa. Right, a isha that's Yoledis, Rashi says, don't go to Yoledis, just bring a chatas and a oila. So if she already brought her chatas and then she died, then the Yershan can bring the oila. Oilasa or mesa, but if she brought the oila and then she died, and she didn't bring the chatas, lo yavi Yershan chatasa. Yershan don't bring the chatas. Why? Because ain't chatas la'achar misa, to lachal mesh mesina, we saw it in the end of Horius. But upon him, the oila, the Yershan can bring. Now, if the Yershan bring her oila, certainly the oila is not going to be mechaper for the isha, right? It's not going to be mechaper for the deceased, right? Because Rashi says ein kapara lamesim. So what do you see from there? You see that if the Yersha can bring the oila, it's kosher to still bring it, but it's not mechaper, it's not meratza. So you have a concept of ksheir and vein meratzin by oila that's bola achar misa. So too over here in the Mishnah, if it's nizbechu shloi lishman, it's kosher and it's not meratza. So he's telling Rish Lakish, you find another similar, you find the variation of this halacha by Yoledes, where you bring an oila, the Yershim bring the oila, it's kosher and meratza. Amalei, so Rish Lakish said, Medina lach ba'oila. I agree that by oila you do find such a case, the asil achamisa. So I understand by an oila why, if it's nizbechu shloi lishman, it's ksherin ve'ena meratza. But Osham de lachar misa, but a carbon Osham that you don't bring lachar misa menolon. How do you know that if it's nizbuch lishman, it's kosher ve'ena meratza? You don't have a parallel case by an Osham. Amarlis Rabbi Eliezer said there machluktecha betzidoi. What do you mean? It's machlukes in our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer omer afa Osham that even Osham it's tak apostle. You know, Rabbi Eliezer says in the Mishnah that Osham is like a Pesach bezmana in a chatas. That if you're nizbech l'shaloi l'shman, if you shlech shaloi l'shman, it's pasal legamri. So you don't need to find a parallel case by Asham where it's kosher ve'ena meratza. It's taka not kosher. It's pasal. This is the guy. This is the person that everybody says he's an Adam Gadol. Come in on a Mishnah Shlema. I'm talking about the Tanakama, the Mishnah, which is basically the whole Mishnah. And Tanakama holds that even a Osham is kosher ve'ena meratza. V'at amrtli Rabbi Eliezer, and you try to tell me a das yochid Rabbi Eliezer. Elo Mishlokish aftach on a pischal and afsho. You have a pasuk. Moitzev sechat tishmer. Yeah, it says in the pasuk Moitzev sechat tishmer v'sisa kashan nedartu l'Hashem l'kecha nedava. And we said hi nedava neder. Right, the drasha we saw on Beis Amid Beis. It's not a dava. Why is the Torah all of a sudden referring it as an adava? We said earlier that if you shechta shaloi lishma, if you do something wrong, or we saw it over here, mamish tafei amid alf on the top, yeah, moitzechat tishmoyer kedel that you could still bring it even though you didn't fulfill your neder, which means it's it's still kosher to be brought like an adava. Okay, so Gemara says 1 second. Yosef b'zei ritzch b'Rabbi Yosef abai gabayu v'Yosef kamri kasha l'shlakish osham dili osel achamisa. If the kasha is from osham, so if nasav latalmud moitzev v'secha, you bring me a rye from moitzev v'secha. Eima haba b'neder menadova laisi v'leratzi. That pasuk is talking about neder nedava. So neder nedava, I see that if you don't follow through on the neder, and the way you were noider it, which means you didn't bring it lishma, so you could still bring it as an adava v'loy l'ratzi. But osham lo laisi klal. Osham is not baba neder, so it's not included in that pasuk. Right? Osham, there are 5 types of hashamas. You bring in one of 5 cases. Hashem gzela, Hashem ilo, Hashem shiv charuf, Hashem nazar, Hashem etzayra. So these are the 5 things you bring in osham for. You can't bring it beneder. So bazoi maybe taka by an osham. Maybe by an osham you can't bring it at all. It's pasal legamri. Which means which means a chatas shachat oisal lechatas, which means the din of lishma applies only to a chatas. It's kosher lishma and shlo lishma it's pasal legamri. From that diak in the pasuk you're medayik that osham would taka be kosher. It's kosher even though it's not meratza. How do I know it's not meratza? Because yochel yiratzu tam aloyim moitz v'secha. So the moitz v'secha is just telling me that even if you bring an osham, which is kosher, it's not kosher all the way. It's kosher only to be brought as an adava, like an adava, but it's not meratza. You're not going to fulfill your chi of osham since it was shaloi lishma. Gemara says 1 second. How could you use the pasuk of moitz v'secha by an osham? Ve'ema abba beneder nadava laisi v'loi liratzi. Asham atsuye nami lirti. 1 second, slow down. Once I know that shar kachim from the dik of chatas, that shar kachim asham is kosher, so say it's kosher all the way. What are you going to tell me? You're going to limit it. Say it's kosher, but it's not meratza from the moitzes fasecha. Moitzes fasecha is only talking about neder and adava. So maybe only neder and adava, right? Neder and adava is not meratza. But asham should be meratza legamri because it's a dik from shachat oisa by chatas. No, it's not meratza, it's kavachomer from oila. Ma oila she'ena mechaperes. Eina meratza. If oila, which is not mechaper, it's not meratza. Yeah, oila is a neder, right? So that's learned from Moitz Sechat Tishmer. So it's not meratza because it's an adava. Osham she'mechaper. Eina din she'ena meratza. Osham, that's mechaper on lavin, right? It's coming to be mechaper for lavim. So it's more chomer, right? It has to be mechaper. So eina din she'ena meratza. Certainly, it's not going to be meratza if you do it shaloi lishma. So Gemara says no. Malo oila shekain kol because it's burned completely on the mizbeach, and since it's burned completely on the mizbeach, that's a chumrah. So maybe that's why it's not meratza if it's shaloi lishma. Shlomim yachichu. Shlomim could be mechiach that even though shlomim also is baba neder, and even though it's not kol on the mizbeach, it's still not meratza. It has other chumras. It has nesachin, duvas chazei v'shoik. So maybe that's why it's not meratza over there. So oil tachiach, oil doesn't have that, and still it's not meratza. V'chaz radin lo rizek rizeh, v'lo rizek rizeh. Tzad hashavish ben kachim v'shachtan shlosh ma ksherin v'ein meratzin. Tzad hashavish is it's kachim, and if you shachtan shlosh ma it's kosher, it's not meratza. Afani avi yosham shu kodesh shachtan shlosh ma kosher v'ein meratza. So therefore, from this tzad hashav, I'll prove to you also that osham is in the same category, that it's kosher, it's not meratza. Gemara says, "Malat tzad hashav shebesh shekin yeshne betzibur." Yeah, oil and shlomim can be brought betzibur, right? Shlomim is brought betzibur. Rashi says by kifse atzeres. Gemara says toida tichiach. Toida is not brought betzibur, and still it's right boba neder, and if somebody shachta shlo lishma, it's kosher ve'ena meratzah. So therefore, you can learn it from toida. Gemara says mala toida shkein tuna lechem. It has a chumrah. You have to bring lachmei toida with it. Or the shlomim yechichu, but shlomim don't need lechem, so doesn't have that chumrah, and still it's not meratza. V'chazor din lo rizik rizev lo rizik rizat tzad hashavish b'shen kachem mishchad shlosh man kosher ve'ena meratza. Afani v'osham shu kodesh chad shlosh man kosher ve'ena meratza. So now we have a tzad hashava from toida, shlomim, and oila, right? So oila has a chumrah of kolol, shlomim has a chumrah of knufas chazev shoik v'sachim, and toida has a chumrah of tu'una lechem. Nobody has each other's chumras, and yet you see that if it's shlo l'shmat's kosher, so too an asham. So the Gemara says still malatz al shalosh which came bon beneder benedava. They come beneder benedava. Elamarava zois ha'toira. The Torah gives us a pasuk where it bundles together all the different types of karbonos. La oil la mincha lechatz la asham luma zevach hashlamim. So kishav hakos l'shlamim. Everything is compared to shlamim. Ma shlamim shein kachem shchad shlashman kshein ve'meratzen. Afani avik asham shekodesh. And if you shaykh it shloshma, it's kosher ve'ena meratza. So the Gemara says, "My chaz is the akshas l'shlamim. My so osham in that pasuk is in between chatas and shlamim. So why would you compare it to shlamim quicker than comparing it to chatas? Akish lechatas, compare it to chatas. Yeah, so compare it to chatas and say just like chatas, if you shaykh it shloshma, it's possible legamri. So too an osham. So the Gemara says, no, you can't compare it to chatas because chatas is exclusive. Hamiyat rachmana oisa. Torah says oisa by chatas. And therefore you can't compare it to chatas, so we compare it to a shlamim, and just like shlamim, if you shech the shlo l'shma, it's kosher ve'ena meratza, so to an asham. Okay, now the Gemara says, Yosef Rav Huna, Rav Nachman, Yosef Rav Sheshes Gabayu, V'yasvi ka'amri. They all sat together, and they said like this, Kachel l'shlokish asham l'yasalach misa. Shlokish's question was from asham, because asham, you don't find the case of kosher ve'ena meratza, because you don't find the case of Bol Achar Misa. In other words, if you find the case of Bol Achar Misa by Nasham, then you find the concept of kosher, it's kosher to bring it, Ve'ena Meratza, because in Kapar Labailam, Lamesim. So the Gemara asks, Lema later, Belazar, Asham Nami Osal Achar Misa. Why doesn't Rabbi Belazar say to Rish Lakish, no, I have a case of Asham that's Bol Achar Misa? What's the case? So Rashi explains, like, let's say the Balaam dies. With an asham, the halach is you let it graze, and then you wait till it gets a mum. Once it gets a mum, you take the money, you buy an adava, you buy an oila, you bring it as an adava. That's a form of bal achar misa, even though the asham itself can't be brought lachar misa. But you could bring the oila, which you buy after you paid it. So the Gemara says that's a form of bal achar misa, and that oila that comes, it's kosher to bring it on the mizbech, obviously, but it's not maratza. So the Gemara says, Amul Rav Sheshes. Asham my karev l'meisarai. Meaning you found me a case of bringing an asham l'achar misa with a dmei pidyon, with the money that you take from the pidyon and you buy an oila. Chatas nami mikra karev l'meisarai. If so, then chatas should also be kosher ve'ena meratza. The Mishnah is possible if you shechtat shlo l'shma. But if you find the case of chatas bol l'achar misa, which is this example of karev l'meisarai, chatas the same idea. Suppose, let's say, a person's mafresh two chatois. One is a backup, and then he doesn't need the backup. So now the backup is available. What do you do with it? You can't bring it as a chatas because you already got the scupper with the first one. So you let it go. You let it graze until it gets a mum. And you're paid it, and then you buy an adava with it. So if that qualifies as a case of ba la'achar misa, so this is not exactly la'achar misa, but it's ba, chatas has a case of kosher ve'ena meratza. You bring that oila. It's obviously not meratza, it's not mechaper, but it's still kosher to bring in place of the chatas. The Gemara says, yeah, you're right, but chatas avagav the karva mesar, even though you have that case, miyat rechmanahu, Torah is mamayit, and chatas by saying chatasu, that chatas shaloi l'shma it has to be hukrav with all the avodas l'shem chatas. As the Gemara says, asham nami ksiv behu. What do you mean? Asham, it also says hu by an asham. Hasham. The who is said in the Torah after the Haktorah. The Hektorah is Makon of Zvechel Hashem Asham Hu. Ketanya. Asham remember who El Lachar Haktorah Samurim Buatzma Melaktir Amun Kosher. Right? but the Evid, if you don't do Aktar Samur and an Asham, it's still kosher. So what's the Hu darshanik? If it's not being Mamayit, Shaloi Lishma, and it's not being Mamayit Aktar Samurim, so what's Hu doing? Like a Turun Rav, Asham Shnitak L'Iyah Shchat Istam kosher. Only an Asham was Nitak L'Iyah, which means Bezin said, take it out and let it graze until it gets a mum, then pipoid and bring an oila. That kind of Asham, that Bezin already disqualified, they said let it go graze. If somebody grabs that from the field and brings it as a carbon stam, it's kosher because it's considered an oila, which is nitak en, loy nitak loy. Unless Bezin pretty much paskins that this behema should be brought out into the fields to graze until it gets a mum, and then somebody brings it as a stama, then it's kosher. But loy nitak l're'iyah, loy. But if Bezin didn't say that, it was never uprooted the Shem Asham, so therefore it doesn't work. My time I'm across Asham hu, baviyasi yehei. Baviyasi yehei. It stays b'kedushas Asham until Bezin says they uproot the Shem Asham from it. Okay. So the Gemara Vaiti, Yasvi Rav Nachman Rav Sheshes, V'Yosef Rav Ada B'Masna Gabayu, V'Yasvi Ka'amri. Hod Ka'amri Rav Belazar, Matzin B'Ban Achamis Shenkshei V'Meratzin. When Rav Belazar responded to Rish Lakish, right? We're going back again to that conversation. We're analyzing that conversation. When Rish Lakish said, I don't get it. If it's Shaloi Lishma, and it's Lo'olu L'Bailam Shem Choyva, it should be Pasal L'Gamri. Mechates you can bring it out to the Mizbeach. What kind of gray zone is that? So Rabbi Lazar told him, we find such a gray zone by Yeledes, right? Yeledes that died and she didn't have a chance to be Makar of the Oila. The Yarshim can bring it and it's kosher, but it's not Meratzah. So you have this gray zone. Okay, very nice. So Rabbi Lazar found him a different case. So why didn't Rish Lakish ask on that case? This also should be pasal legamri, yeah? Either Laisiv Elatzu, which should work, or it should be Pasal Gamri, black and white. No, Yeledes mi yoldu b'nei mi yoldu. Shlakish couldn't ask that. You know why? Because Yeledes, just because she needed a kapara when she gave birth, she needed a ritzoi. B'nei mi yoldu, do they need a ritzoi? Right? In other words, it's not shaykh to ask Laisiv Elatzu, right? If she needed a kapara, it's one thing because she was the Yeledes, but they don't need they're the Yarshim. What does that have to do with them? What do you mean? Who is to say that she wouldn't have been miskaperes if she had some bittul mitzvah assays that she needed a kapara on? Oilus mechaper bittul mitzvah assay. So who is to say that she wouldn't have gotten a kapara for any bittul mitzvah assay that she had? And she needed a kapara for. So she should also be a kapara for the Yarshim. So the Gemara says, to be a kapara for the Yarshim, 1 second, that means they have to own it. Remember the Kanyulu. You want to tell me that the Yarshim are kaina a carbon? Rabbi Yoel said that if somebody leaves over a mincha to his 2 sons and he dies, then it can be makar of that mincha, and there's no problem with shotfas. If you're going to say that Yorshim are always kaina, the karbanas of their parent, nefesh amarachmana, Taris is nefesh, only one person. Here you have 2 banim, so how, if they're kainit be Yerusha, so how can they bring it? So the Gemara says, V'loi kanyilu, so you're going to tell me they're not kainit? Rabbi Yochanan said that you can't do tmura on an animal that was left over, be Yerusha to 2 sons, if they're koinet, the havalo shutfin. Right? Shutfin can't do tmura. Tmura is when you have a behema of hektish and you want to place the kedusha of the behema of hektish on a behema of chulin. So there, the halacha is that it has to be only one person, one owner can do that, but not shutfin. So here it says that they can't Yershim, 2 sons who are Yerush a father, a carbon, they can't do Tmura. So why can't they do Tmura? Because they're Koinet, Pashtas. And Shutfa can't do Tmura. Shutfa, Matzam Amir. If you're going to tell me they're not Koinet, so why can't they do Tmura? It's L'chayra, it's the father's. So let them do Tmura. It's not theirs. Okay, the question is, how would they be able to do Tmura if it's not theirs? Okay, the Gemara is going to ask it in a moment. But either way, the Gemara is now proving that obviously they are koinet, because if you can't do Tmura, it must be they own it and there's no Tmura for Shotfin. The Gemara says, Shani Hasam, Tabakram Hame Yomer L'Rabbis is a Yerush. Torah says that Yerush could do Tmura, yeah, even if he's not koinet. Echad Meimer Vein Shnaim Amirin. Okay, so really Yoshim are not koinet. The reason why they can't do Tmura is because of Gzeres HaKosav. Yeah. Sounds like without the Gzeres HaKosav, they wouldn't be able to do it. Again, it's shver. How would they be able to do it? They're not koinet. Okay, but as the Gzeres HaKosav, they can't do it. Maskav Yaakov ben Har Pkoid Elo Miyato Gabe Meiser Dechsevim Gol Yigal Rabbas Sayoirish. By Meiser, it says that the halach is if the Bailam is Poid the Meiser Sheni, he has to add a chaimish. If anybody else is poided, he doesn't have to add a chaimish. So there's a riboy, even if a yoirish is poided, his father died, he left over Meiser Sheni, the ben is poided, he has to add a chaimish. So the Rabbi says, and here there's a riboy of Gol Yigal. So you're going to say like Homer Yamir, that only one person, only one yoirish, yeah, could be goyled, but not two. You can't make the smiyat by Meiser, because even if the father would have owned it b'shutfis, right, then each one, if they would have been poided, it would have been Meiser v'chaimish. So once that would be the halacha by the father, then you can't make the miyat by Yarshim. From the din that Yoirish could do a Tmura on his father's carbon, right, it's just Gzeres HaKosav, that two people can't do it, but one can do it, yeah. So Gemara asks, if you're going to understand if they're koiner, that's why he could do Tmura. How could he do Tmura? The halacha, first of all, is only the makdish could be Moisef Chaimish if he's goyelet, should be Moisef Chaimish if he's goyelet. A miskaper is a Tmura. The one who's the owner that is miskaper with the carbon, he is able to do a Tmura. Now nobody else. If I'd give Trum on your behalf, I get to decide. I get to decide which kind gets it. But upon what do you see from here? You see that only the miskaper is Isa Tmura. So if the miskaper is Isa Tmura, so how could a son who's not koina his father's carbon, how could he do Tmura? So the Gemara says, Mekiva lemechapra, mekufya mechapra. The truth is that this carbon of the father, even though it's not mechaper for the Yoirish, it's not mechaper mekiva. It doesn't give him an established kapara, a complete kapara, but it does give him some level of kapara. And since he gets some level of kapara with the father's carbon, he's still bechlal Tmura, even according to Rabbi Yoel, although he was not koina it.